Hello, everyone. I'm Teresa Mangum. I'm the director of the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies at the University of Iowa, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this special event on graphic histories. This program, today about these books, started because Rachel Williams, my colleague, worked with the Obermann Center when she first began her own book, Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed. We think of the Obermann Center as kind of an incubator, and Rachel is one of our very successful faculty members who've used that opportunity. So here's our plan for today. I'm going to quickly introduce our three presenters and then turn things over to Julian Chambliss, who will act as our host today. And we'll give you a quick sampling of their work, their three projects, as they introduce themselves in a bit more detail, talking about their work, and then we'll open up for a great conversation. We are being recorded, and we welcome you to add questions to the chat. If the group can, they'll get to your questions by the end of the session. So quickly, introductions. Julian Chambliss is the Val Berryman Curator of History at the Michigan State University Museum, as well as a professor of history and a leader of the consortium Critical Diversity in a Digital Age Research. He's also part of the steering committee of Haystack, and he has an amazing podcast called Every Tongue Got to Confess. Julian, like all three of our presenters, is an amazing publicly engaged scholar, as well as more traditional scholar, and he is working on a great project right now called Beyond Impossible Project on Race and Comics in the United States. And his recent book is called Cities Imagined: The African Diaspora in Media and History. Karlos Hill is a professor of history and the director of African and African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. In addition to the project he'll talk about today, Karlos also has a photo essay book, Beyond the Rope: The Impact of Lynching on Black Culture and Memory, the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, A Photographic History, two different books, excuse me. And the photographic history is quite extraordinary, and I believe his backdrop comes from that book. He also has such an impressive public presence and leads an Oklahoma Teacher Summit Institute to talk about how to teach these materials. And so we're so grateful to Karlos for being here today. And finally, my own colleague, Rachel Marie Crane Williams. Rachel is professor in the departments of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies, and she is also in art and art history. She's also our university ombudsperson at the moment. Rachel has done extensive research on women and incarcerated women, and started, I believe, her graphic work writing, for example, summations of research in small graphic comics form to make widely accessible for groups like the Justice Institute. In addition to the project that she'll talk about today, Rachel has also published this year another stunning and moving graphic history, Elegy for Mary Turner, an illustrated account of a lynching, from Verso. And with that, I will turn things over to you, Julian.
Well, I want to say thank you to the Obermann Center for the invitation to participate in this great conversation. As Teresa pointed out, my name is Julian Chambliss. I sometimes shorthand myself and say I studied a real and imagined city. In my early days, my dissertation was about planning, and really, I think about comics as an urban project. And one of the things that you can see here is, as a scholar who deals with comics, I see a lot of potentiality in the page to tell stories about communities of color and practices that shape culture. So some of the work that I've done is really sort of focused on uncovering stories of race and community. A lot of the work I've done in Central Florida, exploring the history of communities like Eatonville and the Black community in Central Florida, is really sort of dependent upon trying to understand sort of hidden narratives that are locked away. In some ways, comics are an important medium to tell historical stories that are lost or buried in the archival record. So this this bio comic here from Gus Henderson is actually, he was a African-American leader in the post-Reconstruction era who did a lot to promote civil rights and citizenship, but almost forgotten in the public record. And the ability to tell his story in comic form makes him accessible to adults and children to help tell a more robust and complete story of the Black experience in that context. As a teacher, I often think about comics as an archive of the American experience. And some of the things that I'm putting my students into thinking about is creating critical and creative projects that interpret, explore, and really bring to the fore the way that comics can be an important narrative about culture and about people and about the experiences that shaped the 20th century. So a project like Black Kick, which you're seeing here, this is a model of a kind of zine project that I have my students do, because I wanted them to think about comic book characters and use that as a way to think about the modalities that are used to describe the Black experience. And in my model, I sort of focus on the Black sidekick and try to think about the ways that Blackness and the visual culture around comics depict Black people in Black spaces to try to intercede and really get them to think about the constructed nature of their understanding of race and culture. So I really see in the work of both Karlos and Rachel important sort of trends that recognize the way that comics can really open the door to really compelling stories. And so it's great to have the opportunity to be in conversation with them. Karlos?
Well, I hate to follow up you. That is so brilliant what you just said, and has have me thinking about just one of the things that you said, comic books as an urban project is going to stick with me for a long time, and just thinking about what that really means. And, particularly as I'm trying to think about doing a graphic history of the 1958 Oklahoma City sit-ins, what will it mean to try to tell that story, understanding and knowing that comic and the comic form is sort of an urban sort of form as well. So thank you for that. I have, I think, a very similar relationship to this medium as you do, Julian. I wanted to tell the story of Emmett Till. I wanted to tell the story of Emmett Till because he's perhaps the most well-known lynching victim in American history. And certainly he's the most well-known lynch victim during the Civil Rights era. And so there are a lot of books on Emmett Till. There definitely is not a need for any other new books necessarily on Emmett Till, because I think we understand the story. We understand the gravity of the story and its historical significance. And so why did I want to take on a book such as this? Part of it has to do with the fact that I don't think any of the books about the Emmett Till murder really focus on Emmett Till, where Emmett Till is the central character. And so one of my goals in sort of creating the Murder of Emmett Till, a graphic history, was to make him the focal point. Instead of him being an object, instead of him being an object and a passive victim in his story, I wanted to bring him to life. I wanted people to understand him as a three-dimensional character who was fun-loving, who was also braggadocious, somewhat mischievous, but someone who had a zest for life, who was, a child. And so I really wanted to try to bring that to the fore, make him, instead of an object, a subject in his own story. And so the graphic format really allowed me to do that. It really allowed me to share with the readers stories about his life that didn't necessarily bear on the story, but would actually help bring him to life so that we understood in deeper ways his death, his murder. And so for me, the graphic form allowed for me to do that in ways that a normal historical account would not, because of the fact that we don't know, a lot about Emmett Till. What we know about Emmett Till comes from people who knew him, right? He never sat down for an interview. He never had the opportunity to sit down for an interview to share with people who he was. And so for me, the graphic history became this context, this format for me to bring him to life and to share a side of him that we typically don't get from normal or from typical historical accounts. And so my hope was to bring to life his story in new and interesting ways through graphics and through dialogues. And it was a very complicated process. I learned this process, as I was writing the book. I think I would do maybe a slightly different book if I were to do it all over again. But I'm certainly looking forward to sort of diving into the intricacies and the complexities of trying to render history through the graphic form.
So of course I have to follow up both of these folks, and I'm kind of having this moment where I'm like, oh my gosh, I am in a conversation with Julian Chambliss and Karlos Hill. So I just, I have to kind of check myself every once in a while and think, I cannot believe that I am in conversation with these folks as a panelist. I want to say, for folks that know me, I think historians hung the moon. I just am so in awe of the work they do and the stories they bring to us. And for me, they are really the true sort of keepers of the lamp in a way, related to, our history, what it means, and why we have to remember it. So, in my mind, they are some of the most important people in our society. I have to say, reading Karlos's book, which is just, and I would really urge you to do it. It's magnificent, and it's really a beautiful, the art is also beautiful. And as a form, it's really been inspiring for me. Reading it, I just was so moved. And I've read a lot about Emmett Till, but I think your book does an incredible job of capturing the character of Emmett Till, the other people, those interactions. You've been able to make things seem that are not seen otherwise. So the two books I have finally finished, and I say that because it did take me a long time. The first one I'll talk about, and the images that you're seeing right now are from Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed, the Detroit Uprising of 1943, published by UNC Press and the Duke Center for Documentary Studies. It was a story that I did not know. I'm always sort of blown over by the things we don't know, that I don't know, that I've come to know. And this story was one of those in particular. So, for me, my family was very involved in World War II. And so my idea of World War II was very different from the actual reality of the country of World War II. And that's, a result of my place and my privilege, and my whiteness, certainly. But so Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed, for me, really flipped everything about what I knew about World War II, about when, in my mind, the civil rights movement really began. And that's contestable, obviously. But the thing that struck me about that series of events is that, 34 people died. 34 people, and that's a lot. The other thing about that number is 25 of those people were Black and 9 were white. 17 of those people that were Black were fatally shot by police. So when I think about the meaning and significance of that story and the stories that surround what happened during those 3 days in June, I see so many through lines to what is happening now in terms of police brutality, in terms of how, levels of accountability. And I really feel like, for me, this story really brings to light why we need to know history so that we don't continuously fall prey to the same old, tropes, patterns of communication, and events repeatedly, And so it was a real challenge for me. I did not grow up reading comics. For me, comics came to life when I watched American Splendor by Harvey Pekar. And then, of course, as an academic, I went out and bought every single nonfiction graphic narrative I could get my hands on, including the work of Joe Sacco, who's been incredibly influential in my own work. I aspire one day to be as amazing as Joe Sacco is, and that's never going to happen. But, that was the standard I was kind of holding myself to. And also, I'm not a historian. I am an artist and a qualitative researcher. And so learning to do history was also really a challenge. So that's a little bit about Run Home. The other piece that came out of Run Home when I was researching sort of rumors that circulate in white and Black communities when there is violence is the story of Mary Turner. And, Mary Turner actually was grounded in, that story is grounded in 1918 during World War I. And there are so many similarities. I mean, obviously the Spanish flu is happening in 1918. Birth of a Nation comes out in 1915. It's screened again in Georgia in 1918. This happens in South Georgia. And so it's really the story about a lynching of not just Mary Turner, but 11 people if we count her child. And it's in Brooks and Lowndes County, Georgia, which was about an hour and a half north of where I went to graduate school. And I was very, very, very familiar with that part of the country. And this story came to me in a very different way. It came to me as images first, and those images were very stark block print images. And so, and that book came out, it took me 2 years to get done from beginning to end. I was just really compelled to make those images, whereas the Detroit book took me almost 14 years. So real difference there. So
I want to pause this and because I think that a lot of people may not necessarily know comics, but I think one of the things that's true for both of you is that you recognize that comics are a really sophisticated medium, that they're actually in some ways more complicated than people might really understand. And so I would like to ask you to sort of talk a little about how the comic allows, and I think both of you have alluded to, allow for you to talk about and display things that are not necessarily, they're in some ways hidden in the documentary record. And I think it's important to recognize that with Karlos's work and with one of Rachel's work, it's a more traditional kind of graphic medium, whereas I think the Mary Elegy work is a collage work, which is another kind of medium. And so, for you, Karlos, what was some of the potentialities? I know trauma, history, biography, these are really classic comic book narratives, but why comics as opposed to a more traditional format? And I would like to point out that your work is part of the Oxford Press Graphic Histories format, and that format is a comic book story in the front and documents in the back. So if you're a history teacher, think of the Bedford St. Martin series, right? It's like a graphic novel in format, right? And so all the important documents that inform the story are actually in the back of the graphic story. And so it's very sophisticated. At some levels, it's a very important, complete cognitive object to give to a student, to give to a person. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I'll try. I agree. The graphic form, the comic book form is so very complicated, and definitely more complicated than writing a traditional article or a traditional book. There's just so many more choices that have to be made. In addition to that, it's a collaborative process. Typically historians, and you know this, Julian, historians work alone. We don't want to be bothered with collaborating typically, but you cannot do that. Typically, you can't do that when you're working in the graphic medium or comic books. But for me, to try to answer your question more directly, there are just so many more things that you have to know in order to render something, or order to render history graphically. And so, for instance, for Emmett Till, I really wanted to bring him to life. I really wanted people to understand him as a 360-degree character. And so what that meant then is rendering that graphically, I needed to know what he looked like. I needed to know what he sounded like when he talked. I needed to know how he carried himself in the world. I need to be able to imagine that and then give direction to an illustrator, because I'm not as talented as Rachel. I had to communicate all of this vision for how he sounded, how he spoke, the cadence, everything to an illustrator. And so you think that that's simple, but it's not. It takes a lot of back and forth, refining until you kind of get it right. I ultimately, as a historian, not an artist, I had to trust that my illustrator, I had to trust his interpretation of what I was trying to communicate, and allow for his voice to come forward, not just my own. And so along the way, I learned that at the outset as a historian. I was like, no, you don't understand. You need to do this. But the process is really about sharing the burden of telling the story and allowing the artist, in my case, Dave Dodson, to trust his vision for how I wanted to bring Till to life. And so there's just so many more choices, so much more collaboration that is necessary to do a graphic history, whether it's, sort of within the kind of the Oxford graphic history style, or if it's a more, less traditional sort of presentation.
Rachel, how would you sort of talk about that?
I'm kind of giggling on the inside because, like, I hear Karlos saying, I had to talk and work with this artist and it was really hard and I had to trust him. So I was so, and I'm going to call some folks out that are on this call, super insecure about my ability to be a historian and write history. And so I remember call Leslie Schwam. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you. She's here. I would have to say, Leslie and Corey, and then Karlos, our conversation was like pivotal for me. But I remember saying to Leslie, so, I read this document. This is the story that happened. Do you think it's okay if I kind of make up some dialogue, like just to sort of put some words in people's mouth? Because it would be so much better if they had said this. And Leslie was like, absolutely not. That would be terrible history. You cannot do that. I was like, oh, okay. A rule I did not know. So like, that was actually really helpful. I was like, oh, okay. Well, I shouldn't do that. And so it was really, for me, phenomenal. So then Corey Creekmer said, so I was like, okay, so I'm struggling because there's these gaps. I can only find so much about what people have said. And then I'm like, I don't know how to fill this in. And Corey said, Rachel, it's a comic, tell the story. And so Corey actually gave me permission, Corey Creekmer, to like use real people, real images, real quotes. So every real person in my book is real. Like what they say is what they said. I didn't make any of that up. But then I had to fill in the gaps with imagined people. And that's where I was like, okay, now I can sort of use my artist side of things to think, what would someone in 1943 say in this moment? How would they tell the story? So I actually had the opposite, where I was like so nervous about what historians would say. And they really, Tim Tyson's another one, guided me very deeply in my work. But I mean, I'm just forever indebted. And Karlos and I had this amazing conversation and, about what does this mean? Teresa introduced us and I was so like, oh. And so I had the flip side of that where I was like, I can draw sort of, but the history part is a whole different thing. So
one of the things that's, of course, very important when we think about comics, as a historian who thinks about comics, of course, the history of visual culture around Blackness is not a positive one.
Right.
And one of the challenges, of course, when you're teaching students about this, is that on the one hand, this is an incredible archive of a language about Blackness in the American experience. You can go back to the 19th century and find caricature sort of rooted in antebellum racism and so on and so forth. Then even as you move into the 20th century, those caricatures persist, right? It's in some cases in consumer culture, they're just now going away. I'm thinking of Aunt Jemima here, right? So the burden of the comic as a medium that tells a story about Blackness historically is something you always have to take into account. But to tell a more accurate story about Black people and Black spaces and Black experience, the techniques of comics can be really important. So what were some of the sort of techniques, sort of modalities in your stories that were really helpful? I note that in both your work, the sort of use of photographs, archival documents, and the comics work together. And I think the effect is magnifying, like it's synthesizing and magnifying in terms of like understanding. So talk a little bit about that question of the visual legacy and sort of turning a corner at some level and telling a story about Blackness. Karlos, you start about trying to tell that story in a different way.
Yeah, this was very difficult for me because for most people who have engaged and interacted with Emmett Till and his story, they've seen the photograph of, his bludgeoned face, lying in casket at his funeral, Mamie Till standing over him, crying profusely. And so that's the most visually arresting photograph connected to his murder. But also just in terms of African-American visual history, I think it is a photograph that literally changed the world. Like, it created the civil rights generation. It created the Emmett Till generation. So visually, there was so much invested in, that photograph that there, to a certain degree, it gave me trepidation doing a graphic history because I felt that it could trivialize Emmett Till's memory if it were rendered graphically or comically. And so part of my strategy to sort of circumvent that was to just be very judicious in sort of, representing the violence, be very judicious in representing even Emmett Till, because I was very conscious of the kind of photographic legacy, that, or at least how people have remembered Emmett Till and this very sacred way in which he's remembered through that photograph. I was very frightened, honestly, about people thinking that I was trivializing it. And one of the reviewers, Oxford has so many reviewers for these books. It was like 12 reviewers for these graphic histories. One of the reviewers was, kind of said this. And so this, I was thinking it as I was creating it. And then when it came to fruition in a review, I really, in my revisions, I really tried to pare back the violence, not to make it palatable or tasteful, but to make sure that I did not in any way trivialize his, how he was remembered, and the gravitas of his story. And so that was one of the things, and I can say more, but those are one of the things that was weighed heavily on me.
Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm just thinking about Dana Schultz and, her painting of Emmett Till and how much controversy for multiple reasons. So, I mean, I really commend you for thinking, being thoughtful about what that means. I would say, in the Detroit book, one of the things I wanted to represent is sort of the resistance and the rich life of Black community in Detroit, and that, you had very beautiful moments, so one of my favorite spreads is this husband and wife, and the husband has, is in a union situation with another worker, and the wife in a spread previous to that is being talked to by another woman sort of about, your husband should join the union, should break the strike line. This is really important. And I pictured this moment in the morning when they're both leaving they hug each other, they kiss each other. She's like, wait, here's your umbrella. This like, I really wanted people to think about, yes, all this violence is happening in the city, but then also while that's happening, there's just regular life going on. There are people holding babies, grocery shopping, kissing each other goodbye, brushing their teeth, just really sort of, what does life look like? The other thing I wanted to represent, and there's a story within there that I'm really into, and at some point I would love to dig in and do this. I found all these archives. I wanted to sort of elevate and make visible the role of women in what happened in Detroit, and especially women who were Black. And there's a story about the Black Detroit Housewives League, which I'm like, holy mackerel, these women are amazing. They set a warehouse on fire in their beautiful, like when you look at pictures of the Detroit Housewives League's meetings, they're in these beautiful dresses. They've got their purses, they've got gloves, they've got hats. And I'm like, imagine these women setting a warehouse on fire. Holy mackerel. So in terms of images of Blackness, I really wanted to be thoughtful about that. And one of the things I loved about doing this book, which is like, tells you probably too much about me, I had so much fun looking for dresses, looking at patterns from the 1940s, looking at dresses and dressing women, that was like a fantastic thing. That I had a lot of fun with. But I think the images of Blackness are actually really important. And the Mary Turner story was much harder for me, in part because, one, Mary Turner's ancestors are still around. I met them. And so, that is a heavy thing to think about. How do I depict this violence? But I also thought I want to think carefully about how to have these images. I want these images to punch you in the gut. But also to make clear that, and in an opposite way, that life was still going on while these 11 lynchings happened in the course of a very short period of time. And so, that was a very different sort of experience.
And, I think one of the things that is, of course, always a front of mind for a lot of scholars in comic studies is the potential for comics to be an educational resource. And the opportunities are really important, I think, in telling, as both of you are at some level, on the one hand, with Karlos telling the story from Emmett Till's perspective, right? Like the subject nature of Emmett Till in the civil rights narrative is inescapable. He was on the cover of Jet magazine. It started, for many people, the modern civil rights era. But in the case of Rachel's work, I think one of the things about uprisings or lynchings is like those voices are often so hard to find, so hard to see, and the traumas that are associated with the Black experience are almost fetishized in our sort of traditional historical narratives. And so with comics, you do get an opportunity to try to do more. And so when you think about these works that you've created in the context of the classroom, what are some of the things that you hope people might do in terms of telling a different kind of story about the things that you wrote about and researched and thought about and created around? What are some of the sort of potentialities for learning that you see with this work? And we can start with you, Rachel.
This is such an artist answer. And for my friends that are artists on here, please don't be offended. This is myself as an artist answer. So I'm obviously not speaking for everyone, but I honestly, when I first did this, I was like, I don't know who the heck's going to read this. Like, I'm not really sure who I'm making this for. I just know I need to make it, which is terrible. But I mean, I'll just be very, very honest about that. I do think that, one, the Detroit book for me, I'm hoping to leave a lot of breadcrumbs. I'm hoping that if a historian read that book, it would offer them opportunities to talk with students about various points leading up to what happened in Detroit in 1943. So what were the union politics? What were the housing politics? What were the policing politics at that time? What was the geography of public space? What was happening? And so those are incomplete stories in my book. And so I'm hoping that, they sort of are an opening or an introduction. So a teacher could say, okay, so you just read 3 pages about Battle of the Overpass. Let's talk more about that. I also, again, I was trying to think of broad themes, and obviously racial politics is a huge theme. Rebellion is a huge theme. Resistance is a huge theme. And really oppression, how does power work? And so I've got a lot of vignettes where I'm hoping people will look at how is power working here? How are imaginations not present? The Mary Turner book is a very different one. And when I imagine audiences for that, I got this question. I really think, I'm thinking about students in high school and beyond. And, just as a way to say the history of lynching is far more complicated than you might imagine. What does lynching mean? Why did it happen? How did it happen? Very, very different from your, what you might have been told or imagined. So, Karlos, I think your book is an incredible resource for educators.
Right. And before you answer, Karlos, I want to remind people if they have questions for either Karlos or Rachel, you can put them in the chat and I will try to get to them. Okay, go ahead, Karlos. Sorry.
No, you're fine. Obviously my book is written in the Oxford Graphic History series. And so those books are aimed at students, undergraduate students in particular, not historians, although we hope historians find value in them. And so this is it is a resource created to help students engage in talking about difficult histories of racial violence and racism. And so that's the whole, for me, that was the whole point of doing the book. I mean, as I said before, there are lots of books on Emmett Till. We didn't necessarily need another one, but a graphic history that would engage students in thinking about this really difficult history. In the back of the book, give some suggestions for how to engage, not just in having a difficult conversation about Emmett Till, but all histories of racial violence. That was really important for me. And so, this book, again, was written for students. In terms of learning and what kind of interesting possibilities it creates for learning, I would say that, in standard histories, it's words that matter, right? It's making an argument with words that we, assess the book on. For graphic histories and for comics, it's about making an argument with images, and the words are kind of in the background. And so, in my graphic history, I aim to have as few words as possible. And so I was ever cutting down. I only left in just enough historical context to help people make sense of time and space and Emmett Till's relationship to it. But if it wasn't necessary, I cut it out. And so, because I wanted the images to carry the story and the words to be kind of in the background. And so what that means then is that graphic histories leave a lot of room for interpretation. Mm-hmm. And for me, it was absolutely necessary to create that room because there's so many things connected to Emmett Till's murder that we don't know. We don't know actually all the individuals who conspired to kill him. And so in the graphic history, the way in which I rendered that is those individuals were silhouetted. And so we don't know who they are because they're kind of blacked out. And so this was me in the graphic form, making an argument, a subtle one, but an argument about the identities of the co-conspirators. We don't know how he died. And so in the scenes in which I depict his beating, it ends with his beating because we don't know if he died in the barn. We don't know if he died later when they were disposing of his body. We just don't know. And so the graphic history format creates an opportunity for virtual narratives. It leaves room for the readers to imagine what happened. And so, and I'll just say this last thing, for me, not only was this book informed by history, but it was deeply informed by narrative theory. I workshopped this book at Ohio State beginning in the summer of 2012. and the narrative theory workshop of that year focused on graphic histories. And so I was reading tons of graphic histories and just getting into the real sort of complexity of like, how do you make an argument with words? And so for me, what students would do in the classroom potentially is to create their own graphic histories, as simple as they may be, because they don't have a lot of time in the semester. But learning how to make arguments with images, I think, is a skill that and something that that I would try to do in the classroom with the graphic histories.
Well, I love that answer, and it does make me think about the nature of the comic as a visual medium versus a textual medium, and the fact that in both of your cases there's a lot of archival material that you're dealing with, sometimes very directly and sometimes very indirectly. And I know from my own experience that that's always a choice, right? Like, how much of this archival material is going to go into this thing that is going to be a comic really becomes a question, depending on, in Karlos's case, you're working with a collaborator. I've worked with a collaborator to create a comic before. I've written a really complicated script. When I see it, it did not look like I imagined it in my head. But, that is my collaborator, and she made good choices. They were just choices I, one, could not make. I don't draw. And two, I did visual references and all these other things, but you're working with someone else. And that really signaled to me, when someone reads this out in the real world, they will see many things that I did not intend. And they will do many things with what they see that I may not be able to predict. So for you as creators who are dealing with historical material, have an abundance of archival material, that is, as all archival material is, it tells a story. It doesn't necessarily tell the story. We all make choices when we write history. You always leave something out because you need to tell a story and you hope it's the best story you can tell. So the burden there is that the opportunity that you have this stuff, the burden is that it's there too. So how do you deal with that in terms of thinking about this work? Is that something that you want to encourage people to engage with on their own, apart from the narrative that you created in the graphic format? Or is this something that it's not important, like you've done what you can with it? I mean, I think in Karlos's case, he's put all the stuff there, which is nice in a way because all the things are there. But talk a little bit about the archive in the context of your work. Go ahead, Rachel.
Oh, I was just going to say, I was just thinking, again, this is where I don't know how to do history. So I had an opposite situation when my Detroit book went to the editor, and UNC Press had never done a comic book before. So they were used to editing historical, typical things. And my editor wrote me, she was like, well, I think we need to footnote everything. And I thought, oh, Lord. I mean, I really almost threw up. And of course, then I pitched a fit, and then I said, okay, I can do this. And then I realized how disorganized I am. And the fact that I had just kind of blown to the archive, sort of like, like it was a party. And so going back and trying to organize those things and find things, where did I find this? Where was this? And then how to footnote it, but not to the point where there were more words than images. Cause I was sort of like, the pages are really crowded. If we add footnotes on every single page with numbers, that's not really a comic. That's sort of different. So we kind of had to go back and forth. And then we did settle on, a who's who, which was really important. And then also sort of footnoting different things that happened just so that people could do that. But the archives are amazing. I was super fortunate because the NAACP's papers related to the riot and the uprisings and the rebellions that happened. And I think about a series of different things happening on those 3 days, depending on the context. People told stories to the NAACP, and they would have multiple people from different viewpoints explaining what happened. So there's a shooting that happens at the YMCA, and you have multiple eyewitnesses saying, well, this is how it happened for me, and this is what I saw. And so for me, that gave me lots of details to work with. But then it, like one guy was like, I left my lunch out. So I came back in and went back out. And, I was like, okay. And then they talked about, being asked to be on a wall with their hands up. But then in that, I was like, some of these stories are really good and useful. And I want to pull, a main story out of that. So the archive for me was incredible. The other archive that I got my hands on was the Detroit Free Press, their photo archives that were just reams of photographs, black and white photographs in file cabinets. And there was a lonely archivist, and she just said, you can have whatever you want. I'll make copies of anything. And that was a treasure trove. It gave me images, it gave me cars, it gave me buildings, it gave me maps, and it was also through another artist's eyes. So like when I got that archive, I could see where the photographer had cropped, had used whiteout, had, really worked with those images. So the archive was incredibly important. And really, I love garage sales. So for me, it was kind of that same experience where I was like, look at all this stuff I can look at. So Karlos, what do you think?
Yeah, no, that sounds amazing. The story you just told, just the work that you did and what you had to overcome mentally, emotionally to do that book. And I felt a similar kind of pressure on me because there's so much weight, and the history of Emmett Till's murder is so weighty. I wanted to do justice to it in a graphic format. And that meant then being very, very intentional. And so I mentioned earlier how I didn't want to trivialize the violence. I didn't want to trivialize even the memory of Emmett Till. But also in trying to tell this story, I knew that I wanted to do it realistically. I did not want to paint a picture, a benign picture of the racial context of the Jim Crow South. And so for me, that meant representing lynching. That meant also utilizing racial epithets. In making the decision to represent or to include in a book racial epithets, I was very worried about how it was going to live in the world and how my intentions as an author, Julian, may not come across later. People might be very offended in including the N-word in a graphic history around Emmett Till. And so I had to make a decision that we were going to render it authentic. We're going to render Emmett Till's context authentically. And that meant including racial epithets. But because I wanted to be intentional and I was very worried about how it could be interpreted, we have in the back of the book, using Emmett Till, a graphic history in the classroom. And so that was my way of being very clear about why I included these, not only racial epithets, but also violent images of lynching. And so this gave me that space that I typically wouldn't have had if I was writing a standard academic history. But it became really important in this graphic history because I was relying so much on the visual and less on the textual. Mm-hmm. And so because that it just creates many possibilities. It creates lots of virtual narratives. And so I needed to try to minimize that by saying very explicitly how and why the usage of that imagery was important, how it should live in the classroom, because this is designed again for undergraduates. That ending gave me space to sort of make that intentionality clear. That's often missing from, standard comics, right? It's just not a part of the form.
So we have a couple of questions, and Catherine Stewart has a question, which I'm going to paraphrase because it's a long paragraph. And so she's a historian, I think, and she really likes graphic histories, but she finds that the nature of the incontrovertible evidence of photographic images, other form of historical evidence, are more compelling, and at some level, because of the nature of truth in our society right now, maybe more important. And so she's asking, in this current moment of truth and evidence, right, under assault, do you worry about this form, the graphic narrative form, being perceived in a way that kind of may not be persuasive for audiences who resist histories of white racial terror? So I didn't do a very good job of doing that. But basically, the danger here is, and I kind of understand, especially in the context of like comics as a juvenile medium, in American context, right? So there's that weight associated with comics.
Yeah.
I would quibble with the sort of like incontrovertible nature of photographs, especially in American. That's just a personal aside, because I've been in places where photographs doesn't matter. But this broader question of like, is this the right way to do this, given the way archives and erasure are very real, right? But we can talk endlessly about this. So there is a danger here that she's alluding to and pointing to, and I think it's worth you guys sort of like mentioning or reflecting on, if you wish.
Go ahead, Karlos.
No, yeah. Okay. Oh my goodness, you guys. No, I'll start. In fact, you'll definitely
I'll pick it up.
finish.
I will help
you. Okay. I think that it really is about intentionality. I don't think that the graphic medium by default trivializes or makes problematic telling, powerful stories in ways that resonate with people. And so, because I think there's a lot of successful examples of comics, not only telling a powerful story, but engendering social change. I've been so amazed by the March series and the ways in which that has sparked conversations and dialogues. And the March series, for people who are not familiar, tells the story of the civil rights movement through the experiences and through the vision of John Lewis, the late John Lewis. It's had such a powerful impact. And I've heard no one talk about how it trivialized the civil rights movement or it didn't quite get it because it was in a graphic form. I think it's a powerful storytelling medium, that there are some problems perhaps in terms of how do you translate, how do you help people understand the deep truths connected to the civil rights movement. I think it can be difficult to do that in the graphic form, but I don't think it's something that you can't overcome. I would just say that for me, I see comics in a very similar light as I see films. When I watch historical films, I'm not necessarily watching them to get the story, to see if the director got the story exactly right. I'm more interested in film and comic books in terms of how they make me feel, how they help me to relate to that history. Because what I've discovered, and what I think you as well, Julian, has discovered, is that the hardest part of our jobs as historians is to get people to care about the history, to feel something connected to the history, not what they know about the history, but what is your relationship to this? And so comics, for me, helps people to actually tangibly imagine this historical space that they were not a part of. It helps to take them there, to help them feel something, to actually ultimately care about the history. And so I just think comics in general do different work than, say, historical books that, historians typically write.
Rachel?
I mean, and I would agree. I mean, so I love this question. I think this is a great question, especially as an artist, and I think about, so I think about one of the things I read regularly, multiple times a year, is I read Audre Lorde's essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury. And as an artist, that to me has such deep, it resonates with me so deeply, because basically, she sort of says there are unknown things that we cannot know until we make them into the world, and so I think images do that same thing. There are images that are far more descriptive, far more powerful than a photograph will ever be. And I mean, I think photographs are powerful, and especially when we talk about history and we talk about the veracity of truth. But I also think, especially when you talk about comics, the opportunities are so much bigger. There were photographs of Detroit, but it was, I had to think, it's a white photographer. They're photographing things from a certain distance. They're looking, that's their eye capturing a certain thing. But, as an artist, I could think, what's the inside of this home look like? What does it look like when two people are holding foreheads to each other and crying and saying, this is terrible. Like, there's all these things that aren't captured in those historical moments that I think really offer an opportunity, for a sequential artist to take up. And so I think, I was just thinking about, Karlos, when you were saying, there's these shadow figures that appear in your book. I had people that were real that I couldn't make up. And so I drew hands, I drew feet, I drew elbows, and there's an image in there of Harry Bennett, who was a terrifying person. And for me, it was, when I looked at photographs of him, I'm like, yeah, he just kind of looks like this sort of pudgy old white guy. Why is he so scary? But then when I drew him having this meeting with this woman with his feet propped up on the desk, thinking, this is a former boxer, the way he would move. There's so many things in that photograph. And then just even exaggerating his size, so I could say he was powerful. He was looming over her. This is very different. There is no historical photograph of that meeting. There's snippets about it, but I was like, how do I depict that visually? But I think these images can be, just as strong as a photograph. I mean, the photo of Emmett Till is probably one of the most powerful images that has been created in the past 100 years. I mean, there is no way to dispute that. But I think there's equal things.
I am honor bound to make sure we end on time. We got like 1 minute. So I'm going to say thank you to Karlos, and thank you to Rachel, thank you to the audience, and thanks to the Oberman Center. If we didn't get your question, I'm sorry, but it's only an hour, so you'll have to lobby for the Oberman Center to do a part 2 of this conversation, and we'll try to do something.
I want us to add my thanks. The Oberman Center would be thrilled to add a part 2 and continue the conversation. And I'll also capture the chat and share that with y'all in case I can talk y'all into writing a short collaborative blog entry or something, just with quick impressions in response to the questions. We have recorded this session, and it will be on the Oberman YouTube channel in about a week, so that you can share with others. And before we go, I always ask this: if you all, the audience, wouldn't mind just taking yourself off mute just long enough to give our panel a warm round of applause. I would love for them to get to hear that. Thank you all so much. Julian and Rachel and Karlos, that was amazing. I could have sat here happily for another hour. It was just so thoughtful and insightful. You guys are just, you are quite a team. This was great.